Estimates vary, but in the 14th century, more than 100 separate European texts attempted to map the geography of hell with numbered levels, circles, or chambers. How to Survive in Hell was never a single book or doctrine. It was a long, evolving survival manual written in sermons, epics, visions, and battlefield chaplain notes, shaped by theology, war, plague, and the mathematics of fear. The problem that created it was not heat, but judgment. In the imagination of medieval Europe and the Near East, hell was not metaphor alone. It was an administrative system of punishment, measured in years or eternity. A lesser-known design compromise appears in early Christian theology. The tension between eternal torment and divine mercy produced doctrines such as purgatory in the 12th century, a conceptual buffer that moderated the severity of hell by inserting an intermediate state of purification. The parents of this survival doctrine were religion, law, and empire. In the 1st century, texts of the New Testament referenced Gehenna, a valley outside Jerusalem associated with refuse and fire. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, apocryphal works like the Apocalypse of Peter described specific torments calibrated to sins. A lesser-known test result of theological debate occurred during the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, where forms of universalism, the idea of eventual restoration of all souls, were condemned, narrowing official paths of escape from hell within Orthodox doctrine. The manual hardened. By the time of Dante Alighieri in the early 14th century, hell had architecture. In the Inferno of the Divine Comedy, 9 circles descend in precise order, each calibrated to a category of sin. A lesser-known production issue of medieval manuscript culture shaped the spread of this survival map. Before the printing press, hand-copied manuscripts introduced variations in commentary that sometimes altered interpretations of punishments, creating regional editions of hell with subtle doctrinal differences. Survival depended on literacy and patronage. Childhood of this doctrine was chaotic. Sermons described flames, but details varied across regions from Florence to Cologne. Preachers used hell as a tool of moral instruction, often with vivid imagery. A lesser-known crew training detail existed within monastic orders. Novices memorized catalogs of vices and corresponding punishments as rhetorical devices, enabling rapid adaptation of sermons to local audiences. The technique standardized fear. Early misunderstandings were common. Many lay believers conflated purgatory and hell, assuming that all post-mortem suffering was identical. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation occurred during the Crusades, when chaplains reframed hell in sermons to emphasize immediate absolution through confession before combat, effectively shortening perceived distance between battlefield death and salvation. The doctrine flexed under the pressure of war. Small changes mattered. The formalization of confession in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 required annual confession for Catholics, institutionalizing a mechanism presented as protection against damnation. A lesser-known countermeasure embedded in this reform was the development of penitential manuals for priests, listing sins and corresponding penances, standardizing spiritual treatment protocols across dioceses. Survival gained procedure. Growth accelerated after 1450 with the printing press of Johannes Gutenberg. Cheap pamphlets and illustrated broadsheets depicted hell with woodcut precision. A lesser-known supply constraint influenced content. Early printers often depended on ecclesiastical approval to avoid censorship, shaping which visions of hell were widely distributed and which remained marginal. Distribution became doctrine. By the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation fractured authority. Martin Luther rejected purgatory, narrowing post-mortem options in many Protestant regions. A lesser-known command doctrine shift followed in some territories. Sermons emphasized assurance of salvation through faith alone, reducing detailed mapping of hell's topography and focusing instead on binary destiny. The survival manual simplified. In Catholic regions, the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563 reaffirmed purgatory and the sacramental system. A lesser-known medical and psychological effect of intense, hell-focused preaching during this era appears in documented cases of scrupulosity, a form of religious anxiety in which believers feared damnation for minor faults, described in spiritual correspondence of the 16th and 17th centuries. The cost of vivid doctrine surfaced in minds. Outside Europe, parallel cosmologies evolved. In Islamic theology, Jahannam was described in the Quran with layers and gates, often enumerated as 7. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact in these descriptions involved imagery of scorching wind and boiling water, reflecting environmental familiarity with desert heat, shaping sensory details of punishment. Geography influenced metaphysics. As centuries passed, Enlightenment rationalism questioned literalist interpretations. By the 18th century, some theologians interpreted hell metaphorically. A lesser-known test result of shifting belief can be observed in declining frequency of hell-centered sermons in certain Protestant regions of England after 1750, documented in parish archives, suggesting reduced emphasis on eternal torment as primary motivator. Fear recalibrated. The peak of how to survive in hell as a cultural force arguably arrived in periods of crisis. During the Black Death of the 14th century, which killed an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population, sermons intensified warnings of damnation. A lesser-known supply constraint during plague years involved shortage of clergy. In some regions, mortality among priests disrupted regular confession, altering perceived access to salvation. Survival doctrine strained under demographic collapse. Another peak emerged in revivalist movements. The 18th century sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards, described hell in graphic detail. A lesser-known psychological effect recorded in accounts of the Great Awakening included fainting and trembling during sermons, reactions interpreted as spiritual conviction but recognizable as stress responses. The doctrine achieved visceral impact. Yet the cost extended beyond emotion. Fear of hell influenced legal codes, censorship, and social conformity. In some colonial American communities, moral offenses were prosecuted partly under threat of eternal consequence. A lesser-known command doctrine shift in the 19th century theology gradually reframed hell as separation from God rather than physical torture, softening imagery while retaining moral gravity. The manual evolved again. Old age for literal hell began in the 19th and 20th centuries as secularization advanced in Europe. Surveys in late 20th century Western Europe showed declining belief in a literal hell compared to earlier centuries, though estimates vary by country. A lesser-known production issue of modern media influenced perception. Cinematic depictions of hell in 20th century film often drew more from Dante than from scripture, standardizing a fictional architecture in popular imagination. Art replaced catechism. Replacement came not with denial of suffering, but with psychological language. Concepts of trauma, guilt, and existential anxiety reframed hell as internal state. A lesser-known countermeasure in modern pastoral counseling involves cognitive behavioral techniques applied to religious scrupulosity, reducing debilitating fear of damnation without rejecting faith commitments. Survival became therapeutic rather than sacramental. Yet legacy endures. In parts of the world, belief in hell remains doctrinally central, shaping ethics and law. In others, it survives as metaphor for suffering under war, famine, or personal loss. A lesser-known command doctrine shift within many modern religious communities emphasizes restorative justice and reconciliation over eternal punishment, reflecting broader cultural movements toward rehabilitation rather than retribution. The quiet moral line at the end of this long arc is simple. Hell, as a survival manual, was always about behavior in the present more than fire in the future. What we saw in its birth and aging was an effort to manage fear with structure, to map the unknown with numbers, and to give human beings a way to endure the thought of consequence. By the late 20th century, surveys in the United States suggested that between 55 and 70% of adults still professed belief in hell, though definitions varied sharply by denomination and region. The doctrine had aged, but it had not disappeared. It had migrated from cathedral walls to polling data, from fresco to focus group, continuing its biography in quieter forms. The problem in this late phase was credibility. Scientific cosmology mapped billions of galaxies, and psychology mapped interior states, leaving less room for literal lakes of fire beneath the crust of Earth. A lesser-known design compromise within 20th century Catholic theology appeared in the 1999 General Audience of Pope John Paul II, where hell was described less as a physical place and more as a state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God, reframing geography into relationship without abandoning doctrine. Architecture became abstraction. Protestant denominations followed varied paths. Some evangelical communities retained vivid imagery of flames and demons, while mainline churches often softened language. A lesser-known test result of longitudinal religious studies in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s indicated that belief in hell correlated more strongly with frequency of church attendance than with level of formal education, complicating assumptions of linear secular decline. The Manual of Survival adjusted to sociology. Childhood habits of fear-based preaching persisted in pockets. Television evangelism of the 1970s and 1980s sometimes revived imagery reminiscent of 18th century revivalism. A lesser-known production issue of broadcast religion shaped this revival. Airtime costs incentivized emotionally intense messaging that retained viewers, amplifying dramatic depictions of damnation compared to more measured theological discourse. Market forces influenced metaphysics. Small changes again mattered more than spectacle. Translation choices in modern Bible editions subtly altered tone. Some rendered key Greek terms as Hades rather than hell, reducing medieval connotations. A lesser-known countermeasure within academic theology involved renewed emphasis on historical critical methods, distinguishing between first-century Jewish apocalyptic imagery and later medieval elaboration, effectively narrowing the interpretive gap between text and tradition. Scholarship trimmed excess. Growth in global Christianity shifted the center of gravity. By the early 21st century, Christianity expanded rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Latin America. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact on theology can be observed in contextual preaching that framed hell using local environmental metaphors, drought, disease, social fragmentation, rather than medieval European fire imagery, illustrating adaptation of doctrine to lived climate and landscape. Geography remained a co-author. At peak cultural tension, hell resurfaced during moments of catastrophe. After terrorist attacks, wars, and pandemics, public discourse sometimes invoked hell, metaphorically, to describe scenes of destruction. A lesser-known psychological effect documented after the September 11th attacks in 2001 involved increased short-term religiosity, including renewed interest in afterlife beliefs, though many surveys noted that such spikes often receded within months. Crisis rekindled vocabulary. Yet the cost of literalism became more visible. Mental health professionals reported cases of religious trauma syndrome among individuals raised in environments emphasizing graphic, eternal punishment. A lesser-known medical detail in this context involves measurable stress responses, elevated cortisol levels, and chronic anxiety symptoms in individuals exposed to persistent fear-based religious messaging during childhood, documented in small-scale clinical studies. Doctrine left physiological traces. Old age brought pluralism. Interfaith dialogue in the late 20th century and early 21st century required re-examination of exclusive claims about damnation. A lesser-known command doctrine shift within segments of evangelical theology introduced concepts such as annihilationism, the belief that the wicked ultimately cease to exist rather than suffer eternally, gaining traction in academic debate and reshaping the internal survival manual without abandoning moral accountability. Eternity shortened. Replacement in some secular societies arrived through metaphor. Hell became shorthand for extreme suffering, war zones, abusive households, refugee camps, without theological framework. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation of language appears in military memoirs from conflicts in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, where soldiers described firefights as hell to communicate intensity to civilian readers, repurposing ancient imagery for modern narrative. The word endured as currency of extremity. Legacy spread beyond religion. Literature, cinema, and music continued to revisit descent narratives. From modern novels to graphic novels, the 9 circles of Dante remain reference points. A lesser-known production constraint in film adaptations of infernal themes has been ratings classification systems, which limit graphic depiction and thereby shape visual language of hell for mainstream audiences, indirectly moderating imagery that once thrived in medieval frescoes. Regulation tames imagination. In academic theology, hell remains a subject of debate rather than settled certainty. Conferences and journals publish arguments for universal reconciliation, conditional immortality, or traditional eternal punishment. A lesser-known crew training detail within seminary education involves required coursework in pastoral care that addresses how to discuss hell without inducing despair, reflecting institutional awareness of psychological impact. Survival now includes conversation. The cost-benefit calculation of fear has shifted. Some sociologists argue that societies emphasizing punitive afterlife beliefs may show lower self-reported crime rates, while others note correlations with authoritarian social structures. Estimates vary, and causation remains contested. A lesser-known countermeasure in modern religious communities has been the development of restorative justice programs, focusing on reconciliation and community repair rather than threat of eternal consequence, aligning moral teaching with contemporary legal philosophy. Justice evolves. Old images fade slowly. Medieval paintings of demons with pitchforks persist in museums and textbooks. Yet younger generations in many Western countries report lower certainty about literal hell than their grandparents did. A lesser-known supply constraint affecting religious institutions in parts of Europe has been declining clergy numbers, limiting frequency of doctrinal instruction, and accelerating theological softening through simple absence of repetition. Silence reshapes belief. Still, in parts of the world, hell remains vivid and central. In certain revivalist movements across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, preaching about eternal punishment continues with urgency. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact within these movements includes the use of large outdoor crusades in equatorial climates, where environmental intensity, heat, humidity, dust, reinforce sensory metaphors of fire and discomfort during sermons, blending physical and spiritual experience. Context molds emphasis. The biography of How to Survive in Hell thus spans 2 millennia. It began as apocalyptic warning, gained architecture through poetry, matured through councils and catechisms, peaked in eras of plague and revival, softened under secular scrutiny, and diversified under globalization. A lesser-known command doctrine shift in contemporary theology emphasizes hope and moral formation over fear-based compliance, reflecting data suggesting that intrinsic motivation produces more stable ethical behavior than external threat. The manual continues revision. It no longer dictates law in most secular states, yet it lingers in conscience and culture. It shapes idioms, art, and ethical imagination. A lesser-known medical and psychological observation from recent studies indicates that belief in eventual forgiveness or redemption can correlate with lower long-term anxiety compared to belief in irreversible eternal punishment, suggesting that